There is only one place it can be. The island kingdom of Numenor.
Numenoreans Origins, exploring the interesting history of this unique clan in the Lord of the Rings universe. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Terry and this is Marvelous Videos. The new show Rings of Power, produced by Amazon, will take place mostly within the confines of Middle-earth.
He was here. Sauron was here. Tell the others to rest while they can.
The dwarves and the elves are in their prime, while the hobbits and men are still maturing and developing in preparation for the mythical land's Third Age heyday.
You bow to no one.
But unlike The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, the Rings of Power show will go beyond the borders of Middle-earth, across the seas to Numenor. The Numenoreans and their legendary island kingdom are mentioned in passing in The Lord of the Rings, although they don't actually appear physically. With the Rings of Power taking place during the Second Age of J.R.R. Tolkien's fictional world, almost 3,000 years prior to The Lord of the Rings, the introduction of Numenor as a major location was almost completely unavoidable.
I will not be made a prisoner.
I would sooner kneecap a stallion than seek to imprison the mighty commander of the Northern Army.
Indeed, all of the trailers and promotional materials have suggested that the legendary island will play a significant part in the first season of the Rings of Power. The Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings books and appendices, and other larger and more detailed books by Tolkien about Arda's terrain chronicle Numenor's rocky but fascinating past.
The expeditionary force will be made up of brave sons and daughters from across fair Numenor.
Even though Numenor doesn't make an appearance during Frodo's adventure or the Battle of the Ring, its presence is felt strongly, with actions made by Numenoreans during the Second Age having a direct impact on the events of the Third Age. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now let's begin.
The westernmost of all mortal realms. The island kingdom.
Exploring the origins of the Numenoreans. The Numenoreans were offspring of the Edain, also known by the name Anatari, of the First Age, who demonstrated themselves to be close associates of the elves, and the elves were the ones who taught them almost everything they knew about their surroundings. The two races also battled alongside one another against Morgoth. During that time, men and elves made a union. Beren and Luthien had a son, Dior Elukil, who married Nimloth of Doriath, and Elwing was later born of their union. The second pair, Tuor and Idril, were Eärendil's parents. Eärendil and Elwing met in the havens of Sirion and had twins, Elrond and Elros, as a result of their marriage. The Valar handed the two half-elves a choice. Elros opted to belong to the race of mankind, while Elrond decided to join the mighty elves. The Edain battled with the powerful host of Valinor in the Fight of Wrath and proved to be victorious. The Edain were exalted and blessed by Eönwë in both mind and body for their part in the war, and the Valar honoured the Edain by providing them with a place to live beyond the turbulent land of Middle-earth. Ulmo built an island midway between Aman and Endor that the Edain named Elena, and this land subsequently became known as Numenor. The great island of Numenor was built from the waters of the sea as a tribute from the mighty Valar to the Edain, who were the fathers of men and who had fought with the Sindar or elves of Beleriand in all of the violent battles of the First Age against Morgoth. Numenor was promised as a prize, a calm after the fight for the Edain. Early in the Second Age, the majority of the Edain who had weathered the conflicts left Middle-earth and went to the Isle, travelling aboard ships furnished and piloted by the elves. The migration spanned over 50 years and transported 5,000 to 10,000 individuals to the island. The realm was formed early on during the Second Age of Middle-earth, and the sire of Eärendil, Elros, who was half-elven, brother of Elrond, and descendant of all the royal families of Edain and the elves, became the first king of Numenor and was an excellent ruler. The Numenoreans rose up to turn into a strong nation under his reign and that of his ancestors, amicable with the elves from both Middle-earth and Eressëa. The elves of Eressëa gave the Numenoreans gifts such as skills and plants. Elros gave magical might and elvish blood to the kingdom. Among these presents were 7 Palantiri, mystical spheres that could predict the future and also could be used for communication for all the lords of Andúni. The Great Sea of Arda completely encircled Numenor, and the sea had a significant impact on Numenor's history and culture. Fish from the sea were an important element of the Numenorean diet from the beginning of the land's history. Numenor's first seafarers supplied them with this main form of sustenance. The Numenoreans quickly developed into expert shipbuilders and seafarers, driven by a desire to traverse and dominate the ocean. The Numenoreans established a powerful nautical civilization. Their learning and craft were refined and enhanced by the Eldar's knowledge, and their bodies and intellect grew in might, and they attained a lifespan that was 3 times as long as the life of the men of Middle-earth. They had extremely good relations with the Eldar, and the Tol Eressëa sent them multiple white ships that carried many presents to Numenor, some of which included flowers, birds and medicinal plants. One noteworthy present was a sapling of Celeborn, which was the white tree of Tol Eressëa, which thrived in the king's courts in Armenelos and was dubbed Nimloth. There was only one restriction to the enthusiastic exploration of the world by the Numenoreans: the fact that the Valar had forbidden them from something. When the Edain were given the island of Numenor, they were absolutely forbidden from travelling west out of view of the island. This was due to the undying lands prohibited to mankind lying tantalizingly close to Numenor's west. As a result, the Numenoreans began exploring the oceans to the east, north and south. They arrived in Middle-earth on the eastern side and explored its coastlines, which included the Eastern Sea, located on the far edge of Middle-earth. The Numenoreans deliver the gifts of their higher culture to the lesser men who resided in Middle-earth, who dubbed the Numenoreans the Sea Kings. The news about the arrival of the Numenorean mariners reached deep inland in Middle-earth, even reaching the secluded and reclusive Ents. The Numenoreans also enjoyed close ties with Gil-galad, ruler of the High Elves from the northwestern corners of Middle-earth, whose vessels sailed through the Grey Havens. In homage to Uinen, who was the goddess of the sea, Aldarion formed the Lovers of Uinen, or Uinendili, which was a guild of seafarers. He assumed the throne and was known famously as the Mariner King. He founded Vinja Londe, which was later renamed Lond-Dare, and was the first Numenorean village in Middle-earth. This port provided access to the enormous woods of Eriador, which the Numenoreans required for shipbuilding. The men of Eriador were filled with astonishment at their arrival, because the men who resided in Middle-earth had long lived beneath a nefarious shadow, and this was a period termed as the Dark Years. And as a result, the men had grown feeble and timid. The Numenoreans began to foster their new allies, teaching them many skills which included stonemasonry, agriculture and metalworking. They also discovered that while their tongues were very distinct, they shared a bit of common ancestry and could communicate about simple themes and subjects. The Numenoreans never stayed for too long on the coasts of Middle-earth, yet the men who inhabited the western shores were comforted by their presence. They cherished their recollections of the lofty sea kings whom they regarded as gods and hoped for their return each time. In the decades that followed, there was a greater amount of activity between Middle-earth and Numenor, with seamen who returned from their travels bringing ore and gems with them. Aldarion later established a guild of venturers in the year SA 750, and many young and energetic men became part of it. Their ships got larger and larger, and they were now capable of undertaking long and distant travels. Aldarion erected Vinja Londe in the vicinity of the Gwathlo as a refuge for restorations, shipbuilding and also timber harvesting. The Numenoreans began to greatly increase their tree cutting around the dense forests of Enedwaith and Minhiriath, but their venture created animosity between them and the native population who lived there, and the forest dwellers fought and ambushed the Numenoreans whenever they could, until the time they were ousted from their forest homes. The Numenoreans destroyed the area's banks, the coastlines, the great roads, tracks and paths, and they drove fighting into the woodlands southwards and northwards from the Gwathlo, and kept warring and destroying what lay ahead of them, pressing towards Enedwaith and Minhiriath. In the year SA 882, Gil-galad alerted Tar Men-Eldor of a new darkness growing in the far east side, spurred on by a follower and devotee of Morgoth, and pleaded for assistance in defending Eriador against this specific and new peril. The Numenoreans began preparing their forces and supplies with the intention of battle. They began to establish permanent colonies in Middle-earth in the early 13th century during the Second Age. As Sauron came closer to the Numenorean areas of control, the region started being under increased pressure from the raiders. He enlisted the help of natives who despised Numenor and utilized them as informants and guides. Though Sauron didn't have the force to attack the garrisons located near the haven or even the ones along the shores of the Gwathlo, his raiders wrought devastation on the outskirts of the woodlands, destroying trees and stores that sold wood, causing great losses to the Numenoreans. The Numenoreans took part in the Battle of Sauron and the Elves, albeit they showed up late to the fight in the year SA 1700 owing to setbacks, when the majority of Eriador had already been wrecked. Tar-Minestir, who was the 11th king of Numenor, gathered and created an armada and dispatched it in order to help Gil-galad. In war, Numenor's armies were unrivaled and practically invincible. Tar-Minestir's fleet reversed the outcome of the war, and Sauron was effectively beaten in the fight of the Gwathlo. Sauron was compelled to flee to Mordor, where he promised revenge on the Numenoreans, and the Westlands were finally at peace. This conflict erupted after the creation of the mighty Rings of Power, which, in particular, included the One Ring. The first trace of the shadow descending upon the people of Numenor was supposed to have begun during Tar-Minestir's administration. The king of Numenor admired and adored the Eldar and supported them during their most dire hour against Sauron, but it started becoming increasingly evident that he also envied them. The Numenoreans started to question the ban that the Valar had imposed on them and the gift of men over time, and the fear of their own mortality crept into their hearts. Thus, the Firstborn felt envious of the immortality of the elves. The Numenoreans' growing strength had an ugly side. The exploitation of Middle-earth's woods had ravaged significant areas of Eriador. Around the year SA 1800, the Numenoreans began trying to carry out conquests on the coastlines of Middle-earth, and their disposition towards the men of Middle-earth shifted. Where they were once educators and friends, they now subdued them and exacted heavy tribute from the native majority of the population, desiring power and wealth. Atanamere and Tarkiriatan the Great, Minestir's heirs, were increasingly dictatorial and greatly oppressed the lesser men who resided in Middle-earth. The shadow upon Numenor reached its noontide during Tar-Atanamere's rule. The Numenoreans who followed his teachings talked down about the Valar and openly opposed the Eldar and Valar, despite the fact that they were afraid of retribution from the powerful Valar if they breached the strict ban. The Numenoreans went on to transform Umbar, which was a port city in the southern corner of Middle-earth, and turn it into a stronghold of sorts. They also considerably expanded the area of Pelagia, which was a settlement in Gondor at the mouths of the great river of Wilderland, the Anduin. A growing number of Numenoreans turned envious of the elves' immortality, resented the strict ban placed upon them by the Valar, and became desirous of eternal life. Those with this opinion belonged to the King's Men faction. The faithful, also known as Elendili or Elf Friends, were those who stayed faithful to the Valar and on amicable terms with the elves while continuing to speak Elvish languages. They were governed by rulers who were called the Lords of Andúni. The King's Men grew powerful under Tar-Ankalamon's rule, which lasted from the year SA 2221 to SA 2386, and the faithful soon became a marginalized minority and were charged with being Valar spies. The King's Men scoured the far southern coastlines of Middle-earth, building landing and trading ports, which evolved into terrible vice kingdoms that left numerous rumors in the lore and tales of men, while the Eldar were unaware of these strongholds such as Umbar. The faithful Numenoreans never played any role in these occurrences, and in the year SA 2350 they constructed Pelagia, also known as the Great Port of Gondor, which became their main refuge. When Ar-Adunakor took over the throne in the year SA 2899, he was the first monarch to take an Adunaic title and started to persecute all of the faithful minority, punishing anybody who dared to speak Elven in public. At the conclusion of all of this, the Eldar never returned to the land of Numenoreans. However, there was some reprieve for the faithful during the reign of Tar-Palantir, who strove to atone for the misdeeds of all the cruel actions of his ancestors and once again fall in the good graces of the Valar. Tar Palantir's beliefs were strongly and completely opposed by his brother Gimmelcad, who was the leader of the king's party, and after his demise, his son Pharazôn went back to Numenor and organized an uprising against the king. When Tar Palantir died, his daughter Miriel had the authority to inherit the kingdom as per the new law, but Pharazôn compelled her into marriage and took the scepter of Numenor for himself. Subsequently, he came to be known as Ar-Pharazôn. The downfall of Numenor. Late during the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn, who was the 25th ruler of Numenor, travelled to Middle-earth to confront Sauron, known to the Numenoreans as Zigur, who claimed that he was actually the king of men and true master of Middle-earth. Ar-Pharazôn arrived at Umbar to fight Sauron's forces, but upon witnessing the strength of Numenor, Sauron's army withdrew and Sauron yielded without a fight. He was transported back to Numenor as a captive, but he quickly charmed the ruler and many other Numenoreans, promising them everlasting life, provided they worshipped his lord Melkor. Ar-Pharazôn commissioned the construction of a 500-foot or 150-meter towering temple at Ar-Menelaos, the capital, with Sauron as his spiritual counselor. As the gloomy clouds of death drew nearer to Ar-Pharazôn, the Dark Lord Sauron pushed the king to seize immortality by brute strength and conquer Aman. The Numenoreans now began preparing for battle with the Valar, which completely enraged Manwë, who sent his storm clouds, which were shaped like eagles, to Numenor. The area was struck by lightning, and the affected area included the temple made in honor of the false god Melkor, where blood sacrifices were being performed. Because Sauron stood in their way and was not harmed, the Numenoreans were even more deluded into believing that he was their true deity. Ar-Pharazôn sailed with his great armament, headed by the man of war Alcarondas, which had set its course towards Valinor and arrived at Tol Eressëa. His vanity caused him to believe that the people of Aman would not just oppose him because they were serene and quiet, so he set up camp near the Tuna Hill. However, Manwë, the powerful Elder King, was conscious about what had occurred, and the Valar subsequently laid down the complete guardianship of Arda. Sauron, instead of being at the forefront, stayed behind. Ar-Pharazôn arrived on Aman's beaches. Manwë, head of the Valar, invoked Eru Ilúvatar, the one god, because it was forbidden for the Valar to take immediate action against men. In response, Eru brought about the changing of the world, in which the formerly flat earth was changed into a globe, Numenor was plunged beneath the seas, and all the forbidden undying lands were permanently gone from the earth. The island's entire population succumbed to the wrath of the true god and was drowned. The catastrophe also took out the majority of Ar-Pharazôn's troops, along with all his power and authority. This was man's second fall, the first one being when men first awakened and fell quickly under Melkor's wicked control. The Numenoreans who were there in Valinor became completely buried beneath the hills that crashed upon them, and flames burst from the summit of the sacred mountain Men-el-Tarma on the Great Island. The terrain fell into pieces and a massive wave surged over it, drowning the land of Numenor at the foot of the waters. Its inhabitants were drowned by the waves, and this catastrophe led to the demise of the Numenorean Empire in the year SA 3319. Sauron himself was trapped in the midst of the disaster he had helped to create. His physical body was shattered, and he, from now on, could never take a human form again. Returning to Mordor, he escaped to Middle-earth as nothing more than a terrible spirit of anger that went like a shadow and a dark wind over the sea.
Rival. You believe I will bring about Numenor's downfall?
Only Numenor can bring about her downfall.
The legacy of the Numenoreans. Few Numenoreans remained on the island after the downfall. These were the Elendili, commanded by Elendil and his children, Anarion and Isildur. They left the Akallabeth with a total of 9 ships, and Nimloth's seedling salvaged by Isildur the evening before its destruction, as well as the 7 Seeing Stones. They arrived in Middle-earth before the Great War. Anarion and Isildur, Elendil's sons, established the 2 Numenorean kingdoms in exile, Gondor in the south and Arnor in the north, after being cast on shore by the storms on the western territories of Middle-earth. The 2 kingdoms made an effort to preserve Numenorean culture. Gondor prospered, and for a short while its grandeur expanded, evoking some of Numenor's might and strength. Other Numenoreans who survived the downfall were members of the King's Men who settled in Middle-earth. They went on to serve the Dark Lord Sauron and were dubbed the Black Numenoreans later on. Umbar was their main place of refuge. Sauron grew power in neighbouring Mordor, laying the groundwork for a conflict that would go on for thousands of years. Some of his minions, known as the Black Numenoreans because they worshipped the darkness and wicked powers and were also enamoured of dark knowledge, had fled Numenor before it was destroyed. Their ancestors stayed in Middle-earth for millennia, allied with Sauron. Long after the fall of Numenor, those who lived strongly believed that the sacred mountain Men-el-Tarma had not been devoured by the seas, but had instead been resurrected to turn into its own brand new island. The descendants of Elendil constructed huge ships once again and sailed off on their hunt, not simply because they ached for their homeland, but also due to the fact that from that position, the peak of Men-el-Tarma, which was named Tol Eressëa, could be seen, and their spirits still aspired to go to the west, despite all cautions and warnings. They never located the summit of Men-el-Tarma, and their journeys merely revealed that Arda was just a sphere. The kings of Gondor and Arnor were direct descendants of Anarion and Isildur, and hence of the lords of Andni. Like their forefathers, they lived very long lives. Arnor's monarchs inherited the Lord of Andni's silver rod, which was called the Scepter of Annúminas, and served as the primary emblem of Arnor's royalty. The great men of Gondor wed late and their offspring were few, and the line of kings gradually died out, leaving Gondor to be ruled by stewards. Aragorn is the leader of the Dunedain, or Men of the West, who were actually the Numenoreans who survived in the north during the conclusion of the Third Age, and had a claim to the throne as a successor of Isildur. The princes who resided in Dol Amroth were descendants of the Faithful who had ruled over Belfalas ever as the Second Age. This family was somehow linked to Elendil as they were blood related to all the lords of Andni. Sam Gamgee notes Faramir's wizard-like aura once, to which Faramir responds, "Perhaps you can sense the air of Numenor from afar." The Black Numenoreans originally, and for many years after Numenor's demise, kept control over Numenor's colonies and maritime outposts in the south of the great river of Wilderland, River Anduin, and on the east of Middle-earth. The closest to Gondor was the Manish Umbar, where a Black Numenorean nobility lived for 1,000 years, wielding great power over Harad, and two of their kind, Fuinur and Heramor, rose to the rank of Harad-Wyth lords. Tolkien adds that the Numenorean race became mingled with inferior men and soon dwindled. Though Gondor repeatedly fought Umbar and all of its allied forces, King Taranon Falastor, who was the ruler during the Third Age's 9th century, tried a diplomatic partnership by marrying the Black Numenorean queen, Beruthiel. Theirs was indeed a loveless marriage. She indulged in the dark and evil arts and maintained 10 cats as informants. So Taranon dispatched her south aboard a vessel that had last been seen passing through Umbar. Gondor finally took over Umbar and controlled it for about 500 years, although the Black Numenoreans continued to incite the Haradrim or the Southrons against Gondor and Umbar. An unnamed Black Numenorean, known by the name the Mouth of Sauron, appeared through the Black Gate and conversed with the leaders of men, also known as Captains of the West, prior to the fight of the Morannon. As time passed, Gondor grew comfortable and assumed of their adversaries of the past that some were given up totally to leisure and ease, and some battled between themselves until they were defeated in their frailty by the wild men. Gondor lost possession of Umbar after the conclusion of the Kinstrife, when Gondor rebels, headed by heirs of the usurper Castamir, captured the port and renamed themselves with the title Corsairs of Umbar. A monument in Umbar, which originally honoured Ar-Pharazôn's conquest of Sauron, survived until an unspecified period late during the Third Age, when it was eventually demolished. What did the mythical land of Numenor look like? An account of the island of Numenor, printed in Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth, was allegedly obtained from the records of Gondor. The island of Numenor lay in the Great Sea, nearer to Aman on the western side than it was to the mainland of Middle-earth on the eastern side. It had the shape of a 5-pointed star, with 5 peninsulas protruding from the middle. The latter is said to have been about 250 miles or 400 kilometers in its breadth, and the peninsulas were roughly the same length. The land itself was slightly tilted to the south south and a bit towards the east. The Cyril was the biggest river in the land. Karen Wynne Fonstad estimates the island's size to be about 167,691 square miles, or 435,017 kilometers square. The island of Numenor was split into 6 major regions, 5 forelands and the central land. Mittelmar, or the inlands, was the middle area, high and landlocked, save for a short shoreline at Romena and having the Meneltarma mountain at its very centre. A large portion of the territory was made up of meadows, pastures and a couple of trees scattered across the land's low downs. Nun Cyril, Numenor's principal river, originated in Mittelmar, close to or on Meneltarma. There has been no confirmation of their exact point of origin. Mittelmar's eastern region, Arendor, was possibly the most populous section of Numenor, with Armenelos the capital and Romena as the 2 most populous cities. The district of Emery, Numenor's major sheep grazing area, was located to the southwest of Mittelmar. Andostar, often known as the Westlands, was a lush forested region bordered by steep cliffs to the north and high seaside cliffs to its west. Its bays housed a number of harbours. The highlands on the north were covered with fir woods, but the forests in the south were mostly made up of beeches and birches on higher terrain and elms and oaks in the valleys. Hjarnostar, also known as the Southwest Lands, featured vineyards and lush farmlands on its eastern side, large beaches along the coast, and mountains and coastal cliffs in the west. The lowest lying region, Hjarostar, or the Southeast Lands, had long smooth coastlines, especially on the western side, and plantations to maintain a steady flow of lumber for shipbuilding. Orostar, often known as the Eastlands, was a cold but fruitful region surrounded by hills on the north. There were enormous grain plantations in the southwest. Forostar, sometimes known as the Northlands, was the least productive region, with heather moorland rising to stony hills in the north and few trees. Its quarries supplied the best construction stone. Tar Meneldur, the 5th king, constructed his lofty tower here to observe the stars. The most populated settlements were along the shore, and they were largely accessible by dirt roads. A paved roadway went from east to west through the island of Numenor, linking Armenelos, Romena, Ondosto, the Valley of Tombs, and Andny. Armenelos, or Royal Citadel, was Numenor's capital and subsequently also its greatest city. It was located inland in the centre of Arendor, some 20 miles from the holy Mount Meneltarma. Romena, about 50 or so miles to the eastern side, was the nearest coast. It housed the imperial palace, which was the king's house. The very first king, Elros, child of the maritime hero Eärendil, built a magnificent tower there, and the grand white tree Nimloth, the living emblem of the kingdom of Numenor, was planted during the reign of the 6th king, the adventurer Tar Aldarion. During the rule of the 25th and last king, the haughty Ar-Pharazôn, a massive circular shrine to Morgoth was erected in the city, almost 500 feet in diameter and as tall to the roofline, on top of which a silver dome loomed. The dome featured an oculus through which the smoke of several charred offerings ascended, tarnishing the silver shortly after it was finished being built. Andúni, or Sunset, was a seaport on the western side of Numenor that faced the Undying Lands, and this was the location where the Eldar used to arrive. Valandil was the very first lord of Andúni, and his descendants were influential in creating Numenorean policy. Armenelos surpassed Andúni as the shadow descended over Numenor. Romena, which meant eastwards for ships travelling to Middle-earth, was a port at the mouth of the Long Firth at the eastern side of Numenor. It rose in importance as shipbuilding and sailing became more popular, particularly under Tar Aldarion's rule. Eldalonde, or Elfhaven, was a western coast seaport where the elves used to arrive from Tol Eressëa, and the river Nanduin spilled into the wide bay of Eldana. It was described by the elves as the most magnificent of all the hideaways of Numenor, comparable to a hamlet in Eressëa.
May Numenor's strength arise in thee. Her wisdom.
The culture of the Numenoreans. The Numenoreans had descended from the allies of the elves, the Edain of Beleriand, and they were divided into 3 factions: the men of Hador, the men of Bor, and the folk of Haleth. Most Numenoreans had originated from Hador's blue-eyed and fair-haired people. The migrants of the western areas, particularly DymondStarr, were predominantly the Beor people with dark hair and grey eyes. A few vestiges of the last folk of Haleth, as well as the few households of the Druidine, were also present. Later, royal Numenoreans were reported to have about 5 times the lifespan of an average man, or 300 to 350 years. Men from the House of Elros had a lifespan of about 400 years, albeit this was cut short owing to their rebellion. The age they considered their coming of age was 25. Adunaic, the Numenoreans' common language, had developed from Taliska, the Hadorians' language. The offspring of the people of Beor were sometimes said to have spoken an accented version of Adunaic, although elsewhere it is claimed that they discarded their original dialect before arriving at the island and started using the Grey Elven Sindarin as everyday speech in Numenor. Adunaic was actually a Mannish language which had descended from the Mannish tongue spoken in Beleriand. The Edain had also mastered Sindarin, which was passed down to Numenor. As a language which was used quite popularly in lore, it has altered very little throughout the millennia. Educated Numenoreans also learned Quenya, which had a higher status in the land than any other language. All books, however, acknowledge that Sindarin was recognized by most Numenoreans and was frequently utilized in aristocratic and noble households. The latter also understood High Elven Quenya and utilized it in works of learning and nomenclature. When the alliance with the elves was severed, usage of Quenya in Sindarin decreased until King Aduna Kor outlawed their study, and knowledge of the elven tongues had really only been kept alive by the faithful. The holy mountain Meneltarma, which was the sacred site where Eru was worshipped, was situated in the centre of Mittelmar. Its flattened top held a large audience during the 3 annual events of Eruletal, Eruk-Yerm, and Eruhantal. These 3 events took place while the people of Numenor ascended the holy mountain slopes in complete silence. These religious practices were abandoned shortly after the year SA 3262 and the worship of Melkor started. It was performed in a cylinder-shaped temple near the City of Kings, Armenelos, built specifically for this purpose, and it involved the sacrifice of women and men over a great fire, the first flames of which were burned from the wood of Nimloth the Fair, the White Tree of Numenor, when Sauron ordered its felling. Prior to the arrival of the Dark Shadow, the Numenoreans kept certain customs associated with the devotion and worship of Iluvatar and respect for the Valar. Among these are the rites associated with the handing of the scepter and giving up of one's life, as well as the placing of a fragrant oil-lair bough on the prow of a ship that is about to depart. The 3 prayers were their most renowned traditions, during which a large crowd went to the sacred mountain of Meneltarma, and then the king proceeded to thank Eru Iluvatar. These were the 3 holy prayers, which were Eruk-Yerm, the spring prayer for a fruitful year, Eruletal, the midsummer prayer for a bountiful crop, and Eruhantal, which was the autumn harvest thanksgiving. They celebrated the Great Bear Dance every fall. The ceremony of the Green Bow of Return was performed every time ships sailed from Numenor. A branch that had been taken from the fragrant tree Oilair was placed at the prow of the ship as a sign of good luck by a Numenorean woman who was a close relative of the captain. Erendis, Tar Aldarion's wife, declined to do so in protest of her husband's frequent trips to Middle-earth, breaking this custom for the very first time. The Numenorean calendar, also known as the King's Reckoning, is quite similar to the Gregorian calendar in that it has a week that consists of 7 days and a year of 365 days, and this structure only changes when there are leap years. It also had exactly 12 months, and the months were called Astar in Quenya. Out of the 12 months, there were 10 months with 30 days and 2 with 31. The calendar was amended by Mardil Voronwe, and the new structure became known as the Steward's Reckoning, in which all months had a total of 30 days plus 2 additional or extra days during the equinoxes Tulier and Yavier. The 5 additional days were holidays, and they included the midsummer, equinoxes, and 2 at midwinter. The reunited kingdom instituted a new reckoning, beginning the first day of the year on 25th of March, which was the date of Sauron's downfall. This brought it closer to the start of the Elven calendar's spring season. Many of Numenor's people were originally fishermen. In addition to the grains grown in Orostar, fish from the surrounding sea were the primary source of nourishment for the Numenoreans. The Dunedain were expert riders who adored horses. If they were bonded to any horse by friendship, they could even call their horses with their thoughts. Numenor lacked paved roads, which would allow carriages to move more freely. They acquired the technique of crafting swords, spears, axes, knives, but primarily bows from the Noldor. Their arrows looked like dark clouds raining on their opponents. The Numenoreans were proficient in the practice of animal husbandry, creating magnificent horses that roamed the open Mittelmar plains. The ocean and the construction of the best ships were the Numenoreans' greatest passions. The majority were erected under the direction of Tar Aldarion, who was also the founder of the Guild of Venturers. Their headquarters were aboard the ship named Umbar.
Anarion told me you deferred twice.
Anarion? What's your brother have to do with this?
Nothing.
Or slightly more than nothing.
What did the Numenoreans look like? The majority of Numenor was inhabited by Edain from the House of Hador, who had very specific physical traits. They were tall, with golden hair, with a very light complexion and blue eyes, whereas the northwestern sections of the island were largely settled in by members of the House of Beor, who were normally dark-haired with brown or grey eyes. Few, if any, of the minority of the people from the House of Haleth had weathered the wreckage of Beleriand, although there is proof that a tiny remnant fled over the sea to Numenor and carried with them the last Druidine refugees who had resided close to the mouths of Sirion. However, they began to leave the island under the reign of King Tar Aldarion, foreseeing the impending darkness that would befall the land. The Druidine had long abandoned the island at the time of Numenor's fall. The Numenoreans were also exceptionally tall, with the average standing at 6 feet 4 inches. Many of their people were far taller than that. Elendil, the greatest warrior of all Dunedain, who was nearly 8 feet tall, had earned the name Elendil the Tall. When compared to the other races of men, Numenoreans had been blessed with exceptional longevity, with the average lifespan ranging from 350 to 420 years. Those from the Elros family, for instance, frequently lived for up to 400 years or more, whereas those outside the royal bloodline only very rarely lived that long. Numenoreans were not immortal like the Ainur or even the Elves, but as a result for their devotion at the time of the War of Wrath, they were granted enhanced lifespans that were 3 times longer than those of mortal men. They also aged at a slower rate than other men. Numenoreans were also the ones who best comprehended the gift of Iluvatar and were fortunate in the sense that they weren't affected by the fear of death. Men of Numenor who finally began to experience the first traces of fatigue from mortal existence would often freely give up their souls and pass away of their own independent will at the beginning of Numenor. This would normally happen in the final years of their existence, such as around the year 400 for those who were exceptionally long-lived. Unfortunately, as part of the decay and deterioration that the onset of the Shadow caused, many Numenoreans came to fear mortality rather than accepting it with open arms. During the realm's twilight, many Numenoreans would hang on to their lives for as long as they possibly could, growing senile and elderly like the rest of men. As the Shadow's presence grew larger, people's lifespans began to shorten. The lifespans of the family of Elros began to decrease to the point that not many would live for more than 3 centuries.
You chose to break with that precedent. Why?
It was the sea that put her in my path.
Why were they previously absent in The Lord of the Rings? After limiting itself to mostly recognizable Middle-earth locations in its first 2 episodes, the new television show based on The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, finally has shown us a location never before seen on screen, the land of Numenor. Indeed, the 3rd episode of the Prime Video series, Adar, spends a significant amount of time on the island realm, which, despite its mythical stature, never has any major feature in either J.R.R. Tolkien's original book trilogy or even in the Peter Jackson films inspired by it. That's right, the Lord of the Rings addendum, as well as less accessible tomes written after Tolkien's death, namely The Unfinished Tales and The Silmarillion, address all aspects of Numenor's past, culture and environment. As a result, the appearance of Numenor in The Rings of Power very definitely left many casual followers perplexed as to how the island nation fits into the larger Middle-earth lore. So why don't we go to Numenor in the Lord of the Rings movies? Simply stated, the island sank. Tolkien envisioned the island nation as the Middle-earth equivalent of Atlantis, which explains why it ends up on the ocean floor, as described in the Silmarillion chapter called Akallabeth. Furthermore, as in the classic Atlantis story, the cause of Numenor's downfall may be summed up in 2 simple words: divine retribution. After defeating Sauron's army and kidnapping him, Pharazôn, now known by the name Ar-Pharazôn, is converted into an evil Morgoth worshipper by the Dark Lord, who wasted no time in doing so. Sauron eventually convinces Ar-Pharazôn and all of his minions that they too will become eternal if they go to battle against the Valar and capture Valinor, while performing blood sacrifices for Morgoth. Predictably, this turned out to be lousy advice, and when the Valar summoned Eru Ilúvatar, who is the supreme deity in Tolkien's universe, things really started heating up. In a cataclysmic catastrophe of genuinely world-changing proportions, and we're talking about going from the Earth being flat to becoming round here, Eru Ilúvatar wipes out the Numenorean fleet as well as the entire kingdom. The few Numenoreans who escaped Eru Ilúvatar's judgment were mostly those who stuck to their former traditions and had friendly relations with the elves. They worked their way to Middle-earth's coasts, led by Elendil as well as his sons Anarion and Isildur. But unlike in the show, The Rings of Power, Elendil doesn't have a daughter in the original lore. Elendil's two sons formed the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, the former of which plays an important part in The Lord of the Rings.
The men of small ambition. I'd much rather it if you were wise.
Numenoreans in The Rings of Power. To bring his most renowned Numenorean heroes into the mix sooner, Amazon's new show based on Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, messes up the chronology of J.R.R. Tolkien's history. As a result, Maxim Baldry plays Isildur, while Lloyd Owen plays the role of his father, Elendil. Emma Horvath plays Eärien, who is Isildur's made-for-TV sister and is also introduced in The Rings of Power. Tar Miriel, the heir to the crown of Numenor, will be played by Cynthia Addai Robinson, while Tristan Gravel will play the evil Ar-Pharazôn, who grabs the throne for himself before falling to Sauron's deceit. These characters would likely not emerge until towards the conclusion of the Second Age of Tolkien's lore, just before the fall of Numenor. Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, appears to deal with Sauron's return and the creation of the Rings of Power, implying that Numenor's vast history is being abridged for the purpose of making a good television show. Elros's rule lasted slightly over 400 years, which is why he is no longer included in the TV show. Between Elros's demise and the happenings of the show, 24 kings reigned on the throne of Numenor, albeit this is one place where the production begins to stray significantly from Tolkien's canon. In Adar, the true king of Numenor, nameless in the show but probably Tar Palantir if we go by the novels, is presently exiled atop a fortress, having been ousted by his own men. Meanwhile, his daughter Miriel serves as Queen Regent in his absence, backed by her powerful advisor Pharazôn. All of this was created by the Rings of Power show's creators Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne, as well as their writing staff. As per Tolkien, Tar Palantir passed away of old age and was not pushed off the throne by anybody, let alone his own subjects. There's also very little evidence in Tolkien's works to imply that Tar Miriel, if we use her regnal name, was in collaboration with the wicked Pharazôn, who is her cousin in the original books, especially given that he compelled her to wed him in order to take over the kingdom. Of course, it's possible that Miriel is merely pretending to be romantically involved with Pharazôn throughout the program, but for the time being, that entire storyline is going off track in comparison to the book. That isn't to imply the Rings of Power has forsaken its source material in terms of Numenorean aristocracy. At the very least, Tar Palantir's portrayal in Episode 3 as someone still loyal to the powerful Valar and friendly with the elves is spot on. It's also evident that McKay and Payne are setting the stage for Pharazôn to put forth a bid for the throne at some point during the show's projected 5-season run, much as he did in the books. In a larger sense, Episode 3, Adar, depicts Numenorean society, even those in its higher echelons, as becoming progressively hostile towards the elves and also the Valar, which is consistent with Tolkien's own history. Similarly, Tolkien's description of Elendil as a high-born noble who defies his tradition is accurate.
I must warn you,
I have touched Palantiri before.
but you have not touched this one.
Conclusion. In Tolkien's universe, Numenor was the greatest human civilization. It was a brilliant example of what humanity was capable of. Sauron ripped it apart around them, with almost no one noticing what was going on. When Isildur chose not to destroy the One Ring, the lineage of kings was broken, and it wasn't restored until Aragorn came to Gondor and restored the kingdoms of men to glory. The Rings of Power will possibly delve further into Numenor and the personality of Elendil, tying the story to Aragorn's adventures through throughout the Lord of the Rings movies. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Faithful believes that when the petals of the white tree fall, 'tis no idle thing.